not-for-profit hospitals, one of the reasons why they're able to avoid paying taxes, because the trade-off is they are asked or required to provide charitable care to those that don't have the means to pay. And every 3 years, hospitals have to do a community health needs assessment, CHNA, where they effectively have to do a study of their local, local population and local status of that population, and take steps necessary to be able to improve it. Now, how much have they done? How effectively have they done it? It's up for debate.
If you walk into a hospital as a patient, the last thing you're thinking about is the hospital's balance sheet. You're thinking about your symptoms, your diagnosis, your treatment. But behind the scenes, every hospital is dealing with a set of financial pressures that most patients never see. Staffing shortages, rising labor costs, shrinking operating margins, and reimbursement systems that often don't reflect the real cost of care. And increasingly, researchers are finding that those financial pressures don't just affect hospital administrators, they affect patient safety, staffing levels, and clinical outcomes. Today, we're talking about the economics behind hospital care and why understanding those financial realities is becoming essential for anyone trying to fix the healthcare system. Welcome back to Vital Discourse. Today, we're once again joined by Dr. Brad Beauvais. Brad is a healthcare policy expert whose research examines how hospital financial performance intersects with quality outcomes and patient safety. In addition to his academic work, he spent more than 20 years in the U.S. Army Medical Service Corps, where he held leadership roles in military healthcare systems. Brad studies something most people outside healthcare rarely consider: how the financial stability of hospitals shapes the care patients ultimately receive. Brad, welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good to be here.
The first thing that we're going to talk about basically is hospital finances. Most people don't think about them, and I just wanted you to talk to us a little bit about, just to give us a 30,000-foot view, how do things get paid for in hospitals? What are the different mechanisms that you use? There are public hospitals, there are private hospitals, there are not-for-profits. Tell us in general how hospitals function. A lot of it's a mystery to most people. It's a black box.
Gosh, yeah, that's it's a multi-layered onion.
That's a 5-hour conversation.
That's right off the bat. So just a little, I'll shape perhaps a perspective on the hospital system, or hospitals in general. First and foremost, like my focus, my primary area of research has always been what we call the short-term acute care hospitals, the STACs. These are your traditional community hospitals, have the emergency room, and the ones that when you say the word hospital, most people think, this is, the hospital that comes immediately to your mind. Of course, there's a number of other hospital types. There's specialty hospitals, children's hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, rehab hospitals, and the list goes on and on. So when we're talking about hospitals, I'm speaking from the perspective of the short-term acute care, and we're probably talking in the neighborhood of 3,500-ish hospitals across the country. From a structural standpoint, these hospitals are about 60% plus or minus are not-for-profit hospitals, or from a not-for-profit healthcare system. Okay, so here in Texas, for example, Ascension Seton, Texas Health Resources, Baylor Scott and White are not-for-profit systems. For-profits, about 20%, and these are systems owned by, for example, HCA, Tenet, and some of the for-profit hospital systems. And then you have, a lot of community and, state and local government-owned hospitals, across, the state and the country. University Health, here in San Antonio, and others. These are the ones that, are owned by the local community, for better, or worse. So from that perspective, of course, there's different tax implications that we'll kind of set aside for a second. But each hospital, as I inferred to kind of in our first segment together, if you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital.
Right.
Because we could have the exact same service line offerings at two different hospitals on the different sides of town, and we're going to have vastly different balance sheets and financial statements. Simply because we are going to have most likely a vastly different payer mix. So payer mix, for those that aren't familiar, is simply, if you think of a pie chart, it's the percentage of your overall reimbursement that is drawn from your different payers. So Medicare, Medicaid, the other government payers like TRICARE, Indian Health, and whatnot, that tends to be a very small segment. And then the rest is commercial. But even commercial payers reimburse it at different rates. So depending on which commercial payers you're exposed to, of course, it's going to change how your overall reimbursement structure, or what it looks like, how much it is, for any given service line. So with that in mind, your financial structure, of course, is vastly different. If I have more exposure to government payers, of course, I'm more of a price taker, meaning I don't get to negotiate much with Medicare or Medicaid, if at all. Conversely, if I'm more of a price maker, if you will, or if I have more economic clout, if I'm part of a larger system like an HCA, I perhaps have more negotiating clout, more market power, and I can negotiate for higher rates, if I'm speaking to one of the major insurers. And of course, this kind of lends itself to the whole conversation about why we've seen the level of consolidation we've seen both on the hospital side as well as on the insurance market side over the past, decade and a half, 2 decades. Simply because both sides have recognized they need to be an ever-increasing silverback gorilla when it comes to the negotiating table. And of course, that leaves out all of the kind of smaller facilities that aren't part of a system, and there's plenty of those as well. So, I guess, is that enough to get you started?
I think it is. I mean, I think it's good to have an understanding what the playing field is like, and it seems like it's very varied, although you can tell me if I'm wrong, but with all the consolidation, we've got, I think before 2000, there were 5,500 or so different hospital systems, and now I believe we're under 3,000 with all the mergers and acquisitions over the past 15 or 20 years. Is that fairly accurate?
Yeah, I think.
And closures, yeah.
I mean, my data set, the data set I typically play with, it hovers around between 3,000, 3,500. Depends, of course, what year we're looking at, because we tend to look at longitudinal data. So it really kind of depends on the year. But yeah, we're in the ballpark.
So with that in mind, you're telling us, what I'm getting from that is that you've got, it's based on the community. If you're in an area with a lot of unemployment and a lower income in general, that the hospital that serves that community is at risk for not having a good balance sheet and not being financially stable.
That's correct. I mean, there's really no other way to say it.
That leads right into the meat of this segment, which is, how does financial stability affect outcome, care quality?
I think we'd be naive if we were to say that it doesn't. I will say most of my research is looking the other way. Most of mine, and especially I did some of that kind of work looking at how the financial structure of the hospital influences quality. Most of mine is looking at how does the quality of care influence, or how is it associated with financial outcomes.
Isn't it bidirectional, or is it different when you look at it from one side versus the other?
It is. I mean, we see, there's certainly influence going both ways. But in general, I will say, and we've been able to prove this through a few different studies, going towards, if financials are my dependent variable, so to speak, if that's what I'm trying to influence. High quality care is highly profitable care. If I improve my, my infection rates, if I improve my fall rates, if I improve, really anything from a quality perspective, either actual clinical care or perceptions of care, I see financials improve.
Well, let me just jump in there for real quickly. What you're saying might make sense, but in actuality, what we're seeing at hospitals is ways of increasing their margin by doing things such as decreasing the number of nurses on the floor, moving towards anesthesia assistants instead of anesthesiologists and CRNAs, decreasing even the number of times that rooms are cleaned in a day just to decrease their bottom line. I have a hard time reconciling that improving healthcare somehow improves the financials of a hospital when we're going to hospitals and instead of being treated by our physician, we're being treated by hospitalists, and our length of stays for something that previously might have been a week is now going down to a day and a half, and we're seeing significant increase readmission rates because of it.
But that's kind of what I'm saying though. Although we see, anecdotally, we can say that we can look at, specific instances, and certainly I don't want to be dismissive of what you're saying. But it's those organizations that don't do that. It's those organizations that actually take that extra step to make sure that my environmental services team is fully constituted, and we're actually cleaning rooms, and so my infection rates go down. If I take those extra steps, we actually see an improvement in profitability.
If it's bidirectional, Brad, I would look at that and say, if you have a lot more money, and you're a healthy, financially stable institution, you don't mind, to Lee's point, you don't mind doing the things you're supposed to do that leads to a lower infection rate.
Correct. So we looked at it.
So are you seeing that more in the for-profit hospitals as compared to the not-for-profit hospitals?
Well, we could actually,
or the not-for-profit a misnomer.
Yeah, well, that's exactly where I was leaning, right?
What does it mean to be not-for-profit?
So it was a 2016 or 2017 study, and I actually have to look it up. You can probably Google it, where of the top 10 most profitable hospital systems, like several of the top 10 were not-for-profit systems, right? Which of course lends that there's a whole line of discussion about, well, if they're not-for-profit systems and they're the most profitable, why are they avoiding paying taxes, and why are they sponsoring things like, stadiums and things that aren't healthcare related?
Exactly.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, that's a can of worms.
There is definitely within across the continuum of hospital systems, there are definitely the haves versus the have-nots in terms of financial strength. I wouldn't necessarily put all of the not-for-profits at the lower end of that spectrum, is my point, right? And so
it still goes by community and payer mix, right?
Well, very much so. I think,
yeah.
And even in which ones are system affiliated versus not. If Big Brother has deep pockets, and I can kind of shore up my shortcomings in my local area because I can tap into the resources of the Big Brother facility, that certainly is going to strengthen the offering for my little local hospital. What we're being challenged by in more recent years, though, is and Lee and I kind of discussed this before we started recording the first session. What we're seeing is some of the large systems are being very, very careful and prudent with respect to how they're allocating capital to bring some of these, more distressed and more rural hospitals or hospital systems into the corporate fold, so to speak, whether that's for-profit or not-for-profit. Simply because there's the concern, and there has to be a lot of very thorough discernment on their part to make sure that the payer mix is adequate so that that distressed asset that they're acquiring doesn't become a toxic asset that suddenly is drawing down or dragging down the system as a whole. And there's several different examples in the past of hospital systems, big brother hospital systems that have acted relatively quickly or perhaps too quickly and haven't done all their due diligence, and then suddenly find themselves saddled with, a whole lot of debt and a whole lot of underperforming facilities.
Yeah. So I think what the message there is that although it's based on community and payer mix, the stability, the financial stability of an institution is very heavily correlated with the kind of care, the quality of care you're going to receive there. But that kind of leads us to the idea of, why are hospitals financially struggling right now? Like what are the pain points that you talk about that makes a hospital distressed suddenly?
The biggest one, honestly, and we've discussed it, at some length, but labor. I mean, labor, of course, COVID was its own, hellscape with respect on multiple dimensions. But labor was probably the most enduring, not enduring, but it just doesn't seem to go away. We perhaps created some false expectations in some labor markets with respect to what individuals might be worth or what they think they're worth. And with that, then you have hospitals and hospital systems that have, of course, bought into having to pay those rates. And so right off the bat, I would say labor is number one. Second to that, of course, and in any, let me back up for a second. In most hospitals or most hospital systems, we're really saying about 60 to 65% of our cost structure is labor. Right? We're highly labor intensive. Now, it's not true at the the physician practice level, but at the hospital level, and the labor mix.
Yeah, 60. If that were my business, I would go under if 60% was my labor. That's insane.
Now, to your earlier comments, so the labor mix, like what percentage of that 60 to 65% are clinicians? I haven't personally done the deep dive on that. I would love to, be able to get into how much of the labor compensation ratio is dedicated to nurses and clinicians, and what types of clinicians, because then that would be a really great study. But beyond labor, supplies are probably another 20 to 25%. Of course, depends on the type of hospital, size of the hospital.
When you say supplies, do you also mean pharma as well as just consumables and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, I tell my students all the time in the hospital administration space, you can make an entire career out of just supply chain management in the hospital space, and how to manage that effectively, and how to you can be a rainmaker just by creating efficiencies, and eliminating waste in the supply chain. It's I have anecdote after anecdote with respect to how much we waste on the supply side. And then the rest is, of course, there's not much left after you have, 60 and 20, we're dealing with 15 to 20% of the remaining structure. So that.
Let me ask you a question about that, though. I mean, has the Affordable Care Act affected this in a positive, negative, or neutral way? I mean, how have things changed in the last 15 years with regard to financial stability of hospitals?
Well, I think if we look through the lens of the ACA, of course, one of the most significant things is we did see an expansion of coverage, the movement away from the no-pay patient to the one that's covered by Medicaid, if we're in a Medicaid expansion state. There is plenty of good evidence, the Kaiser Family Foundation and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, a few others, that point to the fact that, we've seen hospital fortunes improve with this expansion.
And that's primarily because of the facility fees increasing.
Primarily because facilities are now being reimbursed, at least partially, for care that's delivered to patients that formerly were basically charity care, right? And essentially, for those that might not be aware, hospitals, even for-profit hospitals, but notably not-for-profit hospitals, one of the reasons why they're able to avoid, of course, they're charitable organizations, 501c3s and 501c4s, they're able to avoid paying taxes because the trade-off is they are asked or required to provide charitable care to those that don't have the means to pay. And every 3 years, and again, this is under the Affordable Care Act, hospitals have to do a community health needs assessment, CHNA, where they effectively have to do a study of their local, local population and local status of that population, and take steps necessary to be able to improve it. Now, how much have they done? How effectively have they done it? It's up for debate. And we're talking about it all the time at the public health level. But that being said, when we saw Medicaid expansion, some of those that were formerly charity care cases now suddenly became paid patients, right?
Partially paid, yeah.
Partially paid. And the stress on partially, as we've discussed, previously, partially simply because the reimbursement for a Medicaid patient, depending on the service and service line involved, somewhere, 30 cents to 60 cents on the dollar from an operational perspective. So if it's a one-off, if that patient only comes to us and formerly only came to us once a year when they had something acute going on, that it's a good thing. It's a good news story. But what I would contend is, and I've seen it in our own research, when we see the Medicaid percent shift, with every increase in Medicaid percent shift, we see a decrease in operating margin, right? Which means I'm having to provide care because this patient is insured, but I'm losing money on every patient that I see. So as that volume increases, as Medicaid expands, if volume comes with that patient, then I'm seeing a decline in my overall operating margin.
So with that said, I mean we're kind of broaching it a little bit, but we should probably unpack it and talk about uncompensated care and the gaps in coverage that occur across the hospital spectrum that you just mentioned. So we kind of looked at how hospitals are laid out, what types of hospitals there are, in terms of financing, but how do these hospital systems deal with uncompensated care in general? How did they use? First of all, I remember I trained in the early 90s, and a lot of university systems and charity hospitals were around to take care of uncompensated care. How are the hospitals handling it now? Is it mostly the not-for-profits, or are all hospitals taking some percentage of uncompensated care?
I haven't looked at it directly. I probably could with the data we have from the Medicare cost reports. But most of dominant share is coming from our not-for-profit space, right, or not-for-profit hospitals. But I can definitely affirm that it's not exclusive. We do have some hospitals, if nothing else, by virtue of EMTALA, if someone who's undocumented, someone who doesn't have insurance coverage, someone you just, for whatever reason, if they present to the emergency department and we were a receiver or recipient of any sort of government insurance, we cannot refuse care, right? So I may be highly acute, completely have no health insurance coverage. I at least have to be seen and I have to be stabilized in that emergency room, which of course, that's all part of the what hospitals absorb in terms of their operational costs.
But I have to kind of take a step back and ask you a question as a consumer too. I mean, I've noticed, and I know all patients have noticed this. If you look at the way hospitals have changed, when I walk in, I'm walking into a palace in most hospitals. And I mean, even hospitals in Houston that are in underserved areas, you walk in and what I see is structural things that are, kind of speak to a little bit of opulent luxury. As a surgeon, when I go in, some of those places don't have the best equipment. They don't have the best staffing. Nothing's really working well in the background, but certainly a lot of the money that's come into these hospitals, it makes you question, I mean, are they in trouble? I mean, are they at risk of going bankrupt? If are they using their funds properly? Because it certainly seems like they've gotten a hell of a lot more luxurious over the past 15 years. I don't know if that's because of the ACA or it's because of the expanding facility fees, but from a customer perspective, walking in, I've had my health care at hospitals, and they certainly seem opulent. How do you reconcile that as a patient?
Yeah. Well, I think honestly, there's a couple thoughts that are running through my head. One of those is we're not only at the hospital. I would argue that's one man's opinion. Let's leave it at that. I would argue that in some cases we're not just trying to attract patients. We're also trying to attract insurers and labor force. Who wants to go to work, in some dingy, gray, old, dilapidated facility versus, someplace that is, nicer and more upscale. Okay. And likewise for a patient or patient's family, the same sort of mindset. We actually did a study, and it was actually a sidebar conversation I had with an HCA executive rather, several years ago, actually while I was still at Trinity. And he made mention of the fact that they try to maintain, how do you say that? They try to maintain the lowest average age of plant in any market in which they compete. Okay, it's a very obscure, kind of weird ratio to track. Until you start thinking about it from a financial perspective, well, the average age of plant is really built off of accumulated depreciation, which means the higher amount of accumulated or depreciation that is accumulated over several years, it means your physical plant is older, right? Your equipment is old, your buildings are older, your vehicles are older. So they try to maintain the lowest average, age of plant wherever they compete. So kind of a weird ratio. And of course, being the financial nerd that I am, I said, well, I might be able to actually get the data to test that. And we did. And lo and behold, that average age of plant translates into higher quality.
Wow. Mind blown. That's crazy. I would not have expected that. But that's kind of like the broken window theory for bad neighborhoods, right? I mean, you get poor outcomes socially in a neighborhood if you don't fix the windows of the dilapidated buildings. So that I guess that does jive. I wouldn't have expected it from hospitals though, but I'm not surprised, I guess.
Well, and even if you come down to things, for example, like labor and delivery, where do you want to have your baby, right? If the old gray dingy hospital or some more beautiful hospital where it makes you feel better about having your baby there. So I could definitely see that.
Yeah, I agree. It didn't. So I guess I was asking it because, as a consumer, as a patient, as well as a physician, you get you see, I see, and I know Lee sees that hospitals are being given astronomical fees for the things that we do for very cheap in our office. And then all of a sudden we're supposed to sort of say, oh, poor hospitals, they can't make ends meet. And we're scratching our heads asking why. And then we're looking at the money they're spending on the facilities. and we make snap judgments. But it's interesting to know that you've looked at that, and it does correlate with higher quality.
Well, and we also have to recognize too, in some cases, not all, in some cases, we have, and especially on the not-for-profit side, we have donors that come in and say they want to donate money for X, right? Whatever that might be, whether that maybe it's a baby grand piano in the foyer, right? Or maybe they have one in the family and they want to donate it to the hospital. We have billionaires like Michael Bloomberg that wanted to build a whole hospital for his mother, right? And so he donated billions of dollars to Johns Hopkins to do exactly that, to build a women's facility.
Wow.
Of course, for the tax write-off, I'd love to be in that position. But, in some cases, I don't want to say that it's all, with ill intent. And I have a personal issue, and actually my mom and I discuss this all the time with our hometown hospital, not-for-profit system, who suddenly, for millions of dollars, purchased the naming rights to the local, sporting facility, the local, civic center. And doing what I do, I haven't quite figured out how to gather the data necessary to study it, but, explain to me where in that community health needs assessment that millions of dollars are best spent purchasing the naming rights and, for this, this large civic center, in town.
That's actually exactly what I mean. And maybe that's even a better example. Again, we talked about it with the ACA, with insurers, but you can guesstimate at what the next 10 years might bring and how much money you might need for it. But if there's a differential, in other words, if you have extra money, shouldn't there be a way to reallocate that appropriately towards things that actually improve care instead of spending it on things like naming a sports arena or higher compensation to your overly paid administrators?
Well, I think to our earlier discussions, I think the best thing that can happen is we have new market entrants, right? And that's actually what's happening in my hometown, right?
Explain that. Explain what you mean by new market entrant.
So and this is again sample size of one, meaning one community.
Right.
We had basically had a dominant monopolistic power in town that was the primary source for not all, but it was basically the lone hospital in town, right? And then over the years, what we've seen is the fairly successful different ambulatory surgery centers and specialty clinics that have kind of popped up around because that one hospital was such a terror to deal with from a clinical standpoint and is also from a consumer standpoint, patient standpoint. And now within the last year, we've heard that there's going to be a new major health system that's going to be moving into town, right? So suddenly we have this facility that had this kind of monopolistic mindset, like we're the,
only game in town.
The only game in town, the biggest, baddest one on the block. Now suddenly a bigger, badder organization that's got a very good reputation and a very good track record is going to come in, and I think it's going to change the nature of the game. And to me, that's as a a part-time economist but full-time capitalist, I love to see it.
Go figure, right? The market economy makes things run better.
Right.
Free markets, who could have guessed?
Right. Well, and it's not to say that it isn't, a slew of regulatory hurdles and legislative palms to grease and all that kind of stuff. But, the sausage making is something we probably don't want to observe. But in the end, we have this organization that is now going to have to come to terms with being in a competitive space. How does
uncompensated care get covered in rural areas? Where you do have a single monopolistic system like that. Is it much different, or is it more of a stress on that system?
I think it's going to be. Well, I don't know that I have an answer for you, honestly, in that regard. I mean, if you're
how did they do it in your town before the second one came in? I mean,
uncompensated care, and depending on who they are, because we're also in an area of the country where we have a fairly sizable Native American population. So some of those would, migrate to Indian Health Services. So of course there's some degree of coverage there. But for those, and even some of those would, as well as anybody else that's or doesn't have health insurance coverage, would find their way to, the emergency department. They're at the hometown hospital, and effectively the ED becomes the healthcare provider. Now, if they happen to be in a rural setting, and they don't have health insurance coverage, generally speaking, it's a friend or a family member. And I actually have several now that if you sit here and talk about it, several family members that have, or friends of family members that have been transported from wherever they're at, whatever ranch they happen to be at, into the local, hospital. And basically the emergency department becomes the provider of last resort.
One of the other things that I'm seeing in terms of hospitals compensating for this is, and we see it especially with the university hospitals, is now they're popping up remote facilities. For the most part, they're just physician office spaces, and they're duplicating all their physician office spaces at multiple areas distant from their main hospital for two reasons. Number one, to bring more cases back to their hospital, but the other thing is they're allowed to charge and will be paid for the same bloated amounts of money at their distant clinic that they are at their hospital. Now, you can't tell me that.
Yeah, that's the HOPD, right?
Yeah. Now, you can't tell me that their costs are so much more than my costs are having a physician's office. So they're being compensated very, very well in this regard. Look, none of us are going to cry for the hospitals. Let me give you some numbers here. The CEO of Baptist, $3.5 million a year. CEO of HCA, $24 million a year. Advent, $8.5 million a year. You spoke about Baylor Scott and White, $10 million a year. University of Miami, locally to us, CEO, $4 million a year. COO, $4 million a year. How do you justify?
Yeah, but aren't they also like coaches for the Hurricanes?
Right. But no? How do you justify that? How can you claim poverty when you're paying 7 or 8 figures to your CEO?
No, I mean, it's good work if you can get it. And it's, we could claim the same for the insurance companies, CEO of Cerner.
But there's no way that the insurance companies would ever accept $20 million a year. They're probably double that. So, but actually, though, not in defense of it, I am 100% with you, Lee. But remember, they're trying to attract the best and brightest to those positions, and so you have to be competitive with the business model for CEOs for publicly traded companies or something that's similar to a hospital. And if you're offering $500,000 or $700,000, you're not going to get anybody at a CEO level who understands the pressures of that position. I mean, I
would take that for $2 million a year, just to be fair.
So you're saying use free market for the CEOs of hospitals, but not for physicians?
That's correct. That's the problem that I have, is that if you had site-neutral payments and transparency, like we keep talking about, which the ACA does not offer, there is no site neutrality, meaning that if I do something at my place, I get paid the same that the hospital gets paid for the complexity, right? If you have that, then it levels the playing field, in my opinion.
Now, they obviously have to deal with some more regulatory issues and that kind of thing. So I don't know that the number could be exactly the same, but certainly it should be more in line.
I think it should be completely site neutral, but based on complexity. So in other words, I'm not going to do a fibula free flap in my office. That goes to the hospital, and it deserves a heck of a lot more money. But this whole bundling the facility fee and the physician's fee for doctors that are working in a hospital outpatient department, HOPD, like you were talking about, Lee, I don't feel bad for them if they're mismanaging all the money that they're getting. If I got the same money that they're getting at the HOPDs for my place, I wouldn't have to work as hard as I do, and I would make 3 times the amount of money that I'm making now.
No arguments for me.
So we fixed it. We fixed it all.
Yeah, actually, look,
It's got to get it through the legislature.
right, exactly.
That's easy. That's easy.
No, but look, I appreciate your take on uncompensated care. And to close it out, though, I kind of want to look at, now, granted, you do have a military background, although it is as a dog-faced Army guy instead of a Marine. And you're not here, and so I did bring a dog bone for you. I will mail it to you, though. But
Is that coming with that bottle of bourbon that I just saw
right,
a while back?
exactly. I'll steep it in it before I send it to you. But how? So talk to us a little bit about. And I worked as a physician in military healthcare. I was at Portsmouth Naval Hospital and Guam. I was in a lot of different facilities in the Navy giving care. But talk to us about coverage gaps, uncompensated care, and some of the pressures on military health care. It's a little easier because we didn't really think, as a doc, we didn't really think about costs there. But talk to us about the gaps and the financial stability of military systems and what we might learn from it.
I don't know that we can learn a whole lot from a financial perspective from military systems.
As a model, is it efficient? Is it an efficient way to do it? I know there was a lot of waste from what I could see.
Yeah. I think, no matter what model we look at, if we want to listen to William Kissick, the iron triangle of healthcare, cost, quality, and access,
right? All
systems, to include the military healthcare system, contend with that, right? And from a financial perspective, across the 20 years while I was there, I thought military healthcare system. Obviously, we had some great providers. We had some great people. Knew a lot of them. Would gladly serve with a lot of them again. But we also, struggled with this nature of incentives, right? Without an adequate financial incentive to not only improve efficiency, but improve quality. I think those systems, like the military healthcare system, struggle, right? They, when you start talking to a private sector pediatrician and, see how many patients they see in a day versus, what some of my military providers, again, names I'll leave off, they'd struggle with about half or maybe, 3/4 number that the private sector, provider would willingly see in a day. You start to,
but that's socialized medicine, really, right? I mean, you don't, again, you have no incentive to see more patients. And a lot of my counterparts in the Navy, and they were very nice people and very good docs, they would, cut out at 2 p.m. on a regular basis. They'd come in at 9, cut out at 2 with a 1-hour lunch. I mean, and that's, there was no pressure on them to do more.
Right. Now, flip side of that, I've witnessed phenomenal care to the warfighter, specialty care with respect to rehab, limb salvage, PT, OT, things that happened at the Center for the Intrepid. Now there's several of them across the country. Stunning in terms of what they can accomplish for those individuals that have, gone through severe trauma. Second to none. I've encountered, personally, some of the surgeons and some of the work they've done on me, that, I have, they could, I would gladly hold them up against some of the best surgeons, in the world. Our battlefield medicine, second to none. I mean, we've been able to basically sustain a 90% survival rate and above for those individuals that we can get back to definitive care within that golden hour, that hour after injury. And that, to me, that speaks to the issue of, really what I think a lot of our private sector healthcare systems can really draw from is the leader development. I think the leader development side of things is second to none. And my wife and I actually talk about it frequently because she was in the service as well for about 6 years. And, some of the things that we encounter in private sector healthcare and just the private sector space in general, you recognize and start to realize how many people are not truly leader developed.
That's a great point, Brad. That's a phenomenal point. And actually, just to reiterate that and maybe give a little perspective on that, you have to remember that the military medicine it has a lot of selection bias, right? I mean, you've selected for people that want to contribute to this country for many different reasons, but mostly, like for me, I love my country and I wanted to give as much time and effort, one, as a war fighter with the Marine Corps, as an intelligence officer, but then also to give back and try to treat these wonderful people that go out and do the things that nobody else could or would do. So the docs that you're selecting for in that process, although there's no incentive to see more people during the day, when there's an operational commitment, when an aircraft carrier is like what happened to us when we had the USS San Francisco ran into an underwater mountain in the middle of the Pacific. My good friend Chris Cook, who was the general surgeon at the time, was loaded up into a helicopter, flown out into the middle of the raging Pacific, and dropped down onto the deck there and went in and did triage all through the night and into the next day, saving people and patching them up and triaging them and shipping them out. And the hospital, sleepy little Guam hospital, turned into a beehive that worked longer and more under more strenuous circumstances than most residencies ever could or would. So I think that's what that is.
The problem is, though, that there was a decision made to infuse financially into those programs, and I would bet that those programs are operating at a loss. And so the translation to real-world medicine isn't necessarily there when you're dealing with that.
Is that true, Brad? That's what I was getting at before when I was asking, is it, are they efficient or are they losing money?
I think it depends on where we're talking about, right? I think the forward surgical teams, those organizations that are on the battlefield are highly efficient, right? Because they have to be. Like you don't have the time nor the resources to be wasteful, right? Now, of course, they're supported by the U.S. taxpayer and, the Department of Defense or Department of War now budget. But when we start looking at the fixed facilities, back here in the CONUS or continental United States, in the rear with the gear, that's right. Those facilities tend to be much less efficient, much less, of course, they're further away from the fight, right? And there's less incentive to produce and do more. But again, that also depends on what we're talking about. The burn ward down here at Brooke Army Medical Center, highly efficient, highly effective. When you have patients that are coming in that are burned over, 75 or upwards of 100% of their body, those are, tend to be much more efficient, again, because they have to. So it's a little bit, I would argue that it's highly idiosyncratic based on where that care is being delivered.
So if there's one thing you could draw from military medicine, and I think I know what it'll be, that you think could be applied to medicine in the post-ACA age that would make us all better, what do you think it would be?
Yeah, my answer is always going to be leader development.
Leader development.
I don't think that, military isn't perfect in that regard. Certainly we've had leadership failures and we've had leaders that have, had to step aside or be forced out. But I think we do a much better job than pretty much anything else I've seen with respect to developing young leaders into more capable leaders, into senior leaders that can make effective decisions and improve the organization overall.
So, healthcare debates often focus on insurance policy and government reform. But inside hospitals, the reality is a little bit more operational. Financial stability determines staffing, resources, and the ability to deliver consistent care. Understanding those economics is critical if we want a healthcare system that is both sustainable and safe for patients. Brad, thanks so much for coming up and unpacking some of these financial issues in healthcare and helping us to understand hospitals in the U.S. a little bit better, although I still don't feel sorry for them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brad.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure.